I don't have a PowerPoint slide presentation. And I'm probably going to say some things that Dr. Ahmed Farouk will not like. And that is, in some ways, I think his talk is precisely the nature of some of the difficulties of conversing about civil society in Malaysia, and that is, you have to frame it. Can you hear in the back? You can? Okay. Is that you have to frame things in terms of Islam. So a conversation about the way in which religion and politics should be set up here right now takes us back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Why? Well, why is because political culture and religious culture has infused the way Malaysians, specifically Malay Muslims, talk about modern life, talk about modern politics. Which, of course, not surprisingly, would leave a lot of people who are Malaysians who are not Muslims out of the mix. Now, I know why he does it, and I would convert to his version of Islam. But that's not really the issue, right? There is no way to control religious culture, okay? You can set up state mandates for the separation of religion and state. They are implanted in places like the US and in some Western European countries, but you cannot control the interests and the way in which people think through their religious culture in the public realm and when they go into the voting booth. Secularization has happened in myriad ways. There is no one particular model, everyone who thought there was going to be one way forward. There are so many different ways now that some people would say that there is no such thing as secularization. Because if you have to compare the model in France, I mean, let's face it, the model in France is the model in what happened in modern Turkey. And this is not the separation of religion and politics. It's politics controlling religion, and that's not separation. Right? That's a way of the state to control what it considers to be a dangerous force. And that dangerous force is religion, and everyone knows it. And I don't mean it's because it's necessarily dangerous. I just mean it hits people, religious people, in specific ways that will make them think things, and will make them act. That is not going away. Right? That's not going away around the world. So if we look at any number of different examples in various places, we don't even have to look at Malaysia, even though I know we're all concerned here about Malaysia. I'm not Malaysian. I am concerned about Malaysia. And that is the fact that there are a lot of places in the world where religion has reasserted itself, despite the fact that nationalism and the nation state was supposed to be the god of modernity. It's because the nation state has failed. Any political system that tries to meet the needs of its people is probably going to, in some ways, fall short and fail in the eyes of others, right? That's the nature of human history, whether we're dealing with princely kingdoms, whether we're dealing with empires, or whether we're dealing with the modern nation state. The modern nation state is not all it's cracked up to be. And to the extent that nation states are unable to meet the needs of their people, religion will always be there as a counteracting force to try to reform, and yes, in some cases, to try to eat away into the power structure. Both. It can be reformist, it can be for good, it can talk about the way God or the sacred means for human interests to be served, to equality, to social justice. It can speak to those issues, or it can speak to issues of power. That's the power of religion. That's not going away. The modern nation state is also probably not going away, but in interesting ways, 25 years ago, globalization was the theme. We are still living in a global society, but look at how many countries that have reasserted a kind of muscular nationalism, and most of those countries with muscular nationalism have religion running through them. And I'm not saying religion for good, I'm not saying true religion, I'm saying just religion. Look at modern India. The BJP. What is the fate of Muslims and actually some non-Muslims, non-Hindus who are in India right now, whose citizenship is being jeopardized because of the way religion is being infused into the modern nation state? India is secular, or is it? Right? And this is the ongoing debate, especially among the intellectual elite in India. Is India secular? It was supposed to be secular. It still is secular in some ways, in other ways it is not. And I would say the same thing about Malaysia. It is secular in some ways, and guess what? In some ways, it is not. It depends on how you view things, right? So my country in the US, are we secular? Yes, there's a separation of religion and state. Of course there is. We don't have any mandate for having a particular religion to hold office. But it doesn't take much to look at the history of the presidency to see that there has only been one non-Protestant president of the US. How soon do you think we're going to have a Muslim? How soon do you think we're going to have a Hindu or a Buddhist? We've had one Catholic, and now we have a sinner president, right? I mean, so, I mean, there is no way to control the fact that it is very difficult to get past the way that religious culture has been embedded in places, even if they're highly, highly secular, right? And we can see this even in Europe, in some European countries, which we often thought were the most secularized in the sense that they followed the model that religiosity and belief in God also declined along with the other forms of modernization. And even there, you know what? The presence of Muslims have regenerated an interest in Christian culture and civilization. Difference means you're worried about your own difference dominating, right? The fact that Muslims in some European countries had to go to a church to register their marriages and their births upset Muslims. And you know what? They should have been upset. But that was simply the way those countries secularized. And the presence of certain people from outside who are not the dominant culture questioning the form of secularization and questioning whether they're equal citizens and why they have to, in some way, follow this format that if you are a Lutheran, you didn't even think about, right? The questioning of that leads people to question, well, who are these people among us who don't agree with our own culture and are now asking for some special privileges, which is not really special, they're just asking for respect for their own culture. So, from my perspective, religion is here to stay, and it is not a clear-cut way in which it is going to take form and style. That all depends on time and place. You can't control it. You say, we were talking about the fact that Wahhabism, once it gets set loose, can't be controlled. It takes on a life of its own. Religion is no different from Wahhabism. Wahhabism is religion of a certain form. But religious culture is not something that could be controlled very easily in a secular state. Now, it's certainly true that in certain European countries, if somebody is overtly religious and running for office, well, let's just put honestly here, they wouldn't be running for office if they're overtly religious, right? They wouldn't be there. But if an American president, wannabe president, did not in some way show signs of religiosity, that person's not going to get anywhere. Even if they are a sinner in their private life, and they're well known to be a sinner in their private, you better show public signs of religiosity or you're in trouble. Obama had trouble with his own, not just because he was a crypto-Muslim. Actually, I really wish he were a Muslim. But anyway, if he was in trouble because he kept changing up where he went to Sunday services. He went to different places. He probably wasn't fully comfortable in any of them, but he went to different places, and that signaled to some that he wasn't really a serious Christian. Right? It's there. It's there. Now, let me just turn to another, I don't know how much time I have, but I'm trying, okay. The issue of pos. To me, I'm going to use a comparison that I know some people won't appreciate or think is appropriate, but I'll use it. Compare modern Malaysia and PAS, and the role that PAS is playing in the politics of Malaysia, with the role of religious parties in Israel. They are kingmakers in Israel. They will remain kingmakers in Israel. And they have grown nothing but stronger over the years in Israel, right? They have figured out a way to carve out political power to get their own religious needs met in a very highly secularized country, where most Israeli Jews are not religious, and the religious party Jews are. They need to make sure that their own needs get met, and they do so by organizing. And now I find this fascinating because if those of you who might remember with the founding of the State of Israel, most Orthodox Jews, but specifically the Haredim, were against the founding of the State of Israel. They found it to be problematic because people were doing God's work by bringing Jews back to the homeland. And they were against the they were against Zionism because they thought Zionism, in the sense of Zionism recreating Israel, was doing God's work, and you don't do God's work, God does God's work. But once that state gets created, they're back there, and they figure out a way to make it into the politics, and because they know their fellow Israeli Jews are not very religious, they have to make sure that they carve out a space for themselves. Those parties are not going anywhere. Israel is a democracy. Does it have problems with democracy? You bet it does. Guess what? It's a modern nation state. And you have problems with all forms of government. Now, is PAS an Islamist party? Sure it is. Does some of the statements it makes about what it wants scare people? It should. Yes? But it also has figured out a way to operate within the limits of this system, right? And it is, guess what, playing a political game. Sometimes in power, sometimes out of power, knowing that if it brings up the issue of Sharia, it's going to piss people off, and it's going to make news, and guess what, it might get out the vote at certain points. It knows how to manipulate the system. What kind of system? A democratic system. That's what happens in many places, right? It's just the reality of things. And there are any number of Muslim majority societies where religious politics and where Islamists are buried within the system and are trying to participate. Not just Tunisia, they're in the Moroccan system, they're in the Jordanian system. I don't want to talk about Saudi. Saudi is really just this anomalous place in some ways that is very influential because of its money, but its own system doesn't really match up with a lot of what else is happening in the Middle East. But the point is that religion is there, and in many cases these places are secular, and you have the confusing part. Think about this. In authoritarian Egypt, the majority population, it's what, 88%, depending on your idea, 88% Muslim, 90% Muslim. The government is clearly secular in many ways, clearly secular. And it's trying to keep a finger on the scales to keep the Islamists out. And now it's doing a great job. But it has had to become a certain kind of state to do that, an authoritarian state. And it's a pretty brutal one, right, in some ways. I don't think we even know the extent of the brutality because they have been so good at masking things. And modern states have been so good at monitoring. And they're learning. Authoritarian states are learning from one another about how to monitor, about how to oppress, about how to silence, about how to track people in media. They share these values, unfortunately, right? They share them. So here's the thing. The state is, in some ways, the problem in certain countries. And should there be a pushback, and maybe even a moral pushback, with religious values questioning what the state is doing, to be honest, I don't care where you justify the values, where they come from, what God you attribute them to, but if you're trying to reform a corrupt, failing state, good luck, as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't matter whether you're drawing on religion or not. And with that, I think I'll stop.